The air in the Redemption Gulch jail is a foul stew of sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. It clings to the back of Alara's throat, a taste she fears she will never forget. From the deepest, darkest cell, a pair of eyes watch her, glinting like chips of obsidian in the gloom. This is Cain. The name is a whisper of fear in the town, a story told to frighten children and chasten boastful men. They say he's a killer, a robber, a man with no God and no soul. Right now, he is her only hope. She clutches the rusted bars, her knuckles white, her body trembling not from the chill of the stone but from the sheer, precipitous terror of what she is about to do. He doesn't move from his cot, just watches her, a predator assessing strange, foolish prey that has wandered into its den. Her voice is a thread of sound, nearly lost in the oppressive silence. "Wed me," she pleads. Please, a low sound, half chuckle, half growl, rumbles from the shadows. It is the sound of disbelief and cruel amusement. "Wed you?" His voice is gravel and smoke. And with those two words, a question laced with a world of scorn, her last desperate gamble had been thrown. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. She is backed into a corner so sharp it has already drawn blood. Her intended, Thomas, was a good man, a kind man, with hands calloused from farming and a smile that promised a simple, shared future. That future now lay buried with him 6 feet under the unforgiving prairie soil, taken by a fever that had swept through in the spring. What he left behind was a small, 30-acre plot of stubborn dirt and his brother, Silas. Where Thomas had been gentle, Silas was brutish. Where Thomas had seen a partner in Alara, Silas saw a possession that came with the land. He gave her the ultimatum 2 days ago, his breath sour with liquor, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Marry him by the time the circuit judge arrived at week's end, or be thrown off the property with nothing but the clothes on her back. The town offered no sanctuary. Sheriff Barlow, a man whose ambition extended only to the next meal and the bottom of a bottle, had shrugged. Family matter, he declared, eager to avoid any real work. The good women of the town saw her predicament as a stain, a failure on her part to secure her station. She was alone, and so, she had come here, to the one man in Redemption Gulch more feared than Silas. Cain had remained in that cell for a week, nursing a split lip and 3 cracked ribs from a saloon brawl he hadn't started but had damn well finished. He was due to be released in 2 days, the moment his fine for disturbing the peace was worked off. The whispers that followed him were far darker than a simple brawl, tales of stagecoaches and banks in territories far from here, but no one had the nerve or the proof to hold him on anything more. He was a ghost, a drifter, a man who carried his past in the hard set of his jaw and the permanent winter in his eyes. He had seen her walk in, a fragile thing in a worn calico dress, her face pale with a desperation so potent he could almost taste it. He'd expected her to be visiting some other poor soul locked in this cage. He never expected her to stop at his cell. He never expected that desperate, insane plea. He uncoiled from the cot and walked to the bars, the faint light from the grimy window carving shadows across his face. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader. A scar, white and thin, cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a look of perpetual skepticism. "Why in God's name would I do that?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of the earlier mockery. It was a genuine question. Alara flinched but held her ground. Her terror was a living thing. But the alternative, Silas's hands on her, Silas's breath on her neck, was worse. "Because of Silas Croft," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He wants my land. He wants me. If I'm wed, he can't touch either. He's a coward. He won't cross a man like you." She didn't say a criminal, she didn't have to. "And what do I get out of this bargain?" Cain's eyes narrowed, searching her face for the trick, the angle. No one did anything for nothing in this world. That was the first lesson he'd ever learned. She took a shaky breath, offering the only currency she possessed. "The land," she said. "The 30 acres Thomas left me. It's not much, but it has a well and a cabin. Once you've helped me, it's yours. I'll sign it over. I just need you to be my husband long enough to make Silas back down. A week. Maybe 2 inch." A marriage of convenience. A sham. He'd heard of stranger things. He looked past her, through the bars and the open jailhouse door, to the dusty street beyond. He saw the endless road, the life of running that was all he'd known for 10 years. A piece of land. A place to stop, even for a moment. It was a fool's dream, but the offer was a strange and unexpected key. It might just be the key to a different kind of cage. He was about to answer when a heavy tread sounded on the boardwalk outside. Silas Croft filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. His face, florid and fleshy, twisted into a sneer when he saw Alara. "There you are," he boomed, his voice oozing false concern. "Talking to the town trash. This ain't proper, Alara. A woman in your position." He started towards her, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. Alara shrank back, pressing herself against the cold iron of the cell. Before Silas's fingers could touch her, Kane's voice cut through the air, quiet as death but heavy as a tombstone. "I wouldn't," he said. Silas froze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Kane's through the bars. There was no shouting, no overt threat, but the sheer, unadulterated menace in Kane's stare was enough. It was the look of a wolf that knew exactly where to bite. Silas's bravado evaporated like a puddle in the midday sun. He let his hand drop, a flicker of fear in his piggish eyes. "Just looking after my brother's intended," he mumbled, backing away. "She ain't thinking straight." He shot Alara one last venomous glare before turning and stomping out of the jail, his retreat as undignified as his arrival had been arrogant. The silence he left behind was thick with unspoken things. Alara was breathing heavily, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Kane, who hadn't moved, whose expression hadn't changed, but he had defended her. He had pushed back the monster, even from behind bars. He held her gaze for a long moment, the gears turning behind his cold eyes. He saw her desperation, her ridiculous courage, and the small, stubborn piece of land she offered. It was a complication. It was a risk. It was, impossibly, an opportunity. 2 days, he said finally. "Barlow lets me out in 2 days. Be here at sunup. We'll settle this." He turned his back on her then, retreating to the shadows of his cot, the conversation over. Alara stood for a moment longer, her hand over her heart, and then she fled, the outlaw's promise echoing in her ears like both a death knell and a prayer. 2 days later, the sun was a pale, uncertain smear on the eastern horizon when Alara returned. She had not slept. She had spent the time packing her few belongings into a single valise, her hands trembling as she folded the dresses her mother had made and wrapped the 2 chipped plates that were all she had of her family. When she arrived at the jail, Sheriff Barlow was leaning against the doorframe, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, looking profoundly inconvenienced. Kane stood beside him, a free man. In the open air, he seemed larger, more dangerous. He wore the same dark, dusty clothes he'd been arrested in, but now he had a gun belt strapped to his hips, the worn leather holding a heavy Colt revolver. It rested against his thigh with a familiarity that was more unsettling than any threat. He didn't greet her. He simply gave her a curt nod, his eyes sweeping over her and the single bag she carried, a silent acknowledgement of their pact. "He's all yours, miss," Barlow said with a grimy chuckle, as if he were handing over a stray dog. "Just try and keep him out of my saloon." Kane ignored him. "Let's go," he said to Alara, his voice a low command. He took her valise from her hand before she could protest, the simple act so unexpected it left her speechless. He started walking, not towards the center of town, but towards the dusty track that led out to her property. She hesitated for only a second before hurrying to catch up, her worn boots kicking up little puffs of dust as she walked half a step behind him. The walk was silent and agonizingly long. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them. Kane moved with a long, ground-eating stride, seemingly oblivious to the heat. Alara struggled to keep pace, her throat dry, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. What had she done? She had shackled herself to a man whose reputation was a litany of violence, a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. They arrived at the small plot of land that was the source of all her trouble. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, its wood weathered to a silver gray. A crooked porch sagged in the front, and the small vegetable garden she and Thomas had planted was struggling against the dry soil. It was a poor, Pathetic thing, but it was hers. Kane stopped and surveyed the scene. His expression was unreadable. He scanned the horizon, the distant line of mesas, the scrub brush, the rickety fence line. He was like a hawk charting its territory. He dropped her valise on the porch without a word and then walked the perimeter of the property, his hand never far from the butt of his pistol. Alara watched him, her heart in her throat. She felt like a trespasser in her own home. When he returned, he stopped in front of her. "The well is decent," he stated. It wasn't a compliment, just an observation. "The back fence needs mending. A man on a horse could get through." She just nodded, unable to speak. He looked from the cabin to her, then at the vast, empty space around them. "I'll sleep on the porch," he said. It wasn't a negotiation. He unrolled the bedroll he'd been carrying on his shoulder and dropped it by the door. That was that. Their domestic arrangement was settled. The first day passed in a strained, suffocating silence. Alara busied herself inside, cleaning what was already clean, rearranging the few sticks of furniture she owned. She was acutely aware of him, a constant, brooding presence just outside her door. She heard the rhythmic thud of an axe as he chopped the pile of firewood she hadn't had the strength to tackle. Later, she heard the scrape of a tool against wood and peeked out the window to see him fashioning a new handle for the well bucket, his large hands surprisingly deft. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, asking for nothing, expecting nothing. As dusk fell, she cooked a meager stew of potatoes and dried beans, her hands shaking as she portioned it into 2 bowls. She didn't know the protocol. Was she supposed to serve him? She took a steadying breath and carried one of the bowls out to the porch. He was sitting on the top step, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, 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 setting her teeth on edge. He looked up as she approached, his eyes guarded. She held out the bowl. "I made supper," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped sharpening the knife and looked at the bowl, then at her face. He took it from her without a word of thanks and began to eat, his movements economical and precise. Alara retreated back into the cabin and ate her own portion by the dying light of the window, feeling more alone than ever. Later, as she lay on her narrow cot, she heard him settle into his bedroll on the other side of the thin wooden door. She was sharing her home with a dangerous stranger, a man whose thoughts were a closed book, and she was terrified. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized one thing. For the first time in a week, she wasn't afraid of Silas. The next afternoon, Silas made good on his unspoken threat. He rode up to the property, but he wasn't alone this time. 2 of his loutish friends, men who haunted the saloon and lived off the scraps of other people's labor, were with him. They reined in their horses just beyond the broken fence line, their expressions a mixture of derision and curiosity. Kane was in the yard, replacing a rotted post on the porch. He didn't stop his work when they arrived, but Alara, watching from the window, saw his body go still, his posture shifting into one of coiled readiness. Well, Silas called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at this happy little homestead. The blushing bride and her jailbird husband," his friend snickered. Kane slowly straightened up, the hammer still in his hand. He didn't speak. He just looked at them, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I came to give you a warning, outlaw," Silas continued, emboldened by Kane's silence. "That land is Croft land. That woman was promised to a Croft. You can't just come in here and take what's ours. This little game you're playing won't last. Is that a fact?" Kane's voice was soft, carrying easily in the still air. "It is," Silas blustered. "The whole town knows this is a sham. You're a hired gun, and she's a desperate little fool. Once the judge gets here, this whole thing falls apart, and I'll have what's mine." Kane took a step forward, tossing the hammer onto the porch with a loud clatter. He wiped his dusty hands on his trousers and walked towards the fence, stopping a few feet from Silas's horse. He was calm, unnervingly so. "You've said your piece," Kane said, his eyes locking onto Silas's. "Now get off this land." "Or what?" one of Silas's friends sneered. "You'll get thrown back in jail." Kane's gaze flickered to the man, and the man's smirk vanished. "Or I'll get bored," Kane replied, his tone flat. "And you don't want me to get bored." There was something in the way he said it, a promise of swift, uncomplicated violence that was far more terrifying than any loud threat. It spoke of a capacity for cruelty that Silas and his cronies, for all their bullying, could not match. They were loud dogs, barking for show. Cain was a wolf, silent until the kill. Silas swallowed hard, his face reddening. He looked from Cain's unblinking stare to the Colt revolver at his hip. He pulled at the reins of his horse. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his friends scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. Cain watched them go, his body rigid. Only when they were a distant speck on the horizon did the tension seem to bleed out of him. He turned and walked back to the cabin, picking up the hammer as if nothing had happened. But Alara had seen it all. She had seen the quiet, absolute power he wielded, and she had seen him use it, again, to protect her. That night, a wind kicked up from the north, carrying the scent of rain and dust. It rattled the windows and moaned through the cracks in the cabin walls. Alara lay awake, listening to the storm and the sound of Cain's steady breathing from the porch. Sometime after midnight, the fear she'd been holding at bay finally broke through. In her dreams, she was running, but Silas was always there, his heavy hands grabbing at her, his laughter echoing in the wind. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in her cot, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cabin door creaked open. Cain stood silhouetted in the doorway, the dim moonlight outlining his formidable frame. The gun was in his hand. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "A dream," she gasped, clutching the thin blanket to her chest. "Just a nightmare." He stood there for a long moment, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He could see her trembling. He lowered the gun, his mind clearing. His first instinct had been danger, an intruder. But the threat was inside her head. He didn't know what to do with that. Words of comfort were a foreign language to him. He stepped back outside without a word, closing the door softly. Alara thought he had gone back to sleep, abandoning her to her fear. But then she heard the scrape of a chair and the soft click of his gun being placed on the porch beside him. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting watch. He stayed there, a silent guardian on the other side of the door, until the gray light of dawn crept through her window, and her own exhausted breathing had evened out into a true, deep sleep. When she woke, he was gone from the porch, already out mending the back fence, but the chair was still there, a silent testament to his vigil. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest, a fragile flower in the barren landscape of her fear. The next day, the wind didn't die down. It grew stronger, whipping dust from the dry fields into a choking brown cloud. By noon, the sky was a bruised, yellowish gray, and the world outside the cabin had disappeared into a swirling vortex of grit and sand. The dust storm forced them inside. Cain brought in his bedroll and a supply of firewood, closing the door firmly against the howling gale. The one-room cabin, which had already felt small, now seemed to shrink to the size of a shipping crate. The air grew thick and close. They were trapped, two strangers in a space that offered no escape from each other's presence. Alara tried to busy herself with mending, her needle moving in and out of a tear in Cain's shirt she'd found discarded on the porch. He sat at the small table, methodically cleaning his gun, the metallic clicks and scrapes the only sounds besides the roaring wind. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more awkward than ever before. Finally, unable to bear it, Alara spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. For the other day. With Silas." He didn't look up from his work. "He was on our land," he said, as if that explained everything. "Still," she persisted gently, "you didn't have to." He finally paused, laying a polished cylinder on the oilcloth. "A deal's a deal." She knew it was more than that, but she also knew he would never admit it. She looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars that mapped a life of hardship. They weren't just the hands of a gunman. They were the hands of a man who had worked, who had built and broken things. "You're not just what they say you are," she said softly, more to herself than to him. This time, he did look up, and his eyes were sharp, probing. "And what do they say I am?" "A killer. An outlaw." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "Sometimes they're right." He fell silent, and she thought the conversation was over. But then he spoke again, his voice low and distant. "I had a place once. A ranch. Down in the Cimarron territory. My father built it from nothing." He paused, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. A man with a badge and a bigger purse wanted it. He framed me for rustling my own cattle. I lost everything. That's when I learned a man with nothing left to lose is the only one who's truly free. He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. In that brief, stark confession, she saw the ghost of a different man, a man who had been wronged, a man whose bitterness was a shield forged in a fire of injustice. Emboldened by his rare candor, she found herself speaking of her own past. "Thomas and I were going to plant another 10 acres in wheat," she said, her voice thick with memory. "He said this land just needed patience. He was going to build 2 more rooms onto the cabin." He drew up the plans on the back of a seed catalog, her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by her show of emotion. Cain watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. He just listened. When she fell silent, the only sound was the wind, but the space between them felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of their shared losses, a fragile bridge of understanding built between 2 desolate shores. The storm blew itself out by the next morning, leaving a thick layer of fine red dust on everything. The air was clean and cool. The first thing they needed was supplies. The prospect of going into town filled Alara with a cold dread. She had hidden on her land for days, but now she would have to face the whispers and the stares, and this time, she would have the feared outlaw at her side. Their entrance into the Redemption Gulch General Store caused a hush to fall over the few customers inside. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, clutched her purse and stared at Alara as if she had sprouted a second head. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, who had always been kind to her when she came in with Thomas, now looked at her with cold disapproval. His eyes flickered to Cain, who stood just inside the door, his presence sucking all the warmth from the room. "Need flour," Alara said quietly, her face burning with shame. "And salt." Mr. Henderson slapped the sacks onto the counter with more force than necessary. "That'll be 40 cents, his tone was clipped, accusatory. As Alara counted out the coins, she heard Mrs. Gable whisper to her friend, "Shameless. Taking up with that animal. Her poor fiancé isn't even cold in his grave." The words were a physical blow. Alara flinched, her hand faltering. Cain, who had seemed like a statue by the door, moved. He took 3 silent steps to the counter and placed his hand flat on the wood, next to her coins. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Mr. Henderson. The storekeeper paled, his gaze dropping to Cain's hand, then back to his face. "Take the salt for your trouble, ma'am," Mr. Henderson said quickly to Alara, his voice suddenly servile. "No charge." Cain didn't move until Alara had gathered her purchases. He then followed her out, the silence in the store breaking into a flurry of excited whispers behind them. Outside in the harsh sunlight, Alara walked quickly, her head down, desperate to escape the prying eyes of the town. The flour sack felt impossibly heavy. The small victory inside the store felt like nothing compared to the weight of public condemnation. They were outcasts, a pariah, and his whore. The fragile connection they had forged in the storm felt like a fantasy, shattered by the harsh reality of the world. Their sham marriage wasn't a shield, it was a target. Silas, however, was not a man to be deterred by a menacing stare. He was a creature of brute force and cunning, and when one failed, he turned to the other. He knew Cain's reputation would keep him from direct confrontation, so he chose a different weapon, the law. Or, at least, Sheriff Barlow's lazy interpretation of it. 2 days after their trip to town, Barlow rode out to the farm, his horse moving at a funereal pace. He dismounted with a groan, his belly straining the buttons of his dusty vest. Cain saw him coming and met him in the yard, positioning himself between the sheriff and the cabin where Alara was weeding the garden. "Cain," Barlow said, avoiding his eyes. "Got a bit of a problem. You're the one who rode all the way out here." "Sounds like you're the one with the problem," Cain replied, his tone flat. Barlow shifted his weight, sweating. "It's Silas Croft. He's filed a complaint. Says this marriage of yours is a fraud. Says you're conspiring to cheat him out of his brother's property." He finally looked up, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "He's got a document. Some agreement he says he had with Thomas. Says the land reverts to him if the bride, that's Miss Alara, ain't properly and respectably wed." Cain's jaw tightened. A forged document. It was exactly the kind of cowardly trick Silas would pull. "There is no such document." "Maybe, maybe not." Barlow shrugged, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. But the circuit judge, Judge Miller, he's arriving tomorrow. A day early. Silas is demanding a hearing. Miller's a stickler for the rules, Kane. If he thinks you two are pulling a fast one, he'll annul the whole thing, give the land to Silas, and I'll have to lock you up for fraud. The sheriff took a deep breath. You want to stop this, you need to be legally married. In front of him. Tomorrow. Otherwise, it's all over. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The chaos from the title had finally arrived. Their simple, desperate arrangement had just become a binding, legal trap. This wasn't about pretending anymore. This was real. Barlow, having delivered his message, practically scrambled onto his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and an impossible choice in his wake. Kane stood frozen in the yard, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. Run. The instinct was primal, a reflex honed over 10 years of survival. He could be on his horse and gone in 5 minutes, a ghost on the horizon before the sun set. He owed this woman nothing, not really. It was a deal, and the deal had gone sour. He turned and looked at the cabin. Alara had stood up from her gardening, her hands covered in dirt, her face pale with fear. She had heard everything. He saw the terror in her eyes, the stark realization that her last hope was about to be snatched away, leaving her completely at the mercy of Silas Croft. He saw the struggling garden, the mended fence, the clean porch. He saw the small, stubborn piece of ground she had fought for, the life she was trying to build from ashes. If he left, Silas would descend on this place like a vulture. He would take the land, and he would take her. The thought sent a jolt of something hot and unfamiliar through him. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a decade, rage. Not the cold, detached readiness for violence, but a hot, protective fury. He looked from her terrified face to the open prairie, the road that promised escape. For 10 years, that road had been his only home. But it was a lonely home. He looked back at her, at the small, defiant tilt of her chin, at the way she stood her ground, even now. His choice was no choice at all. Leaving her was no longer an option. He walked over to her, his boots heavy in the dust. He stopped in front of her, so close he could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. The judge arrives tomorrow, he said, his voice rough. She nodded, unable to speak, her eyes wide with unshed tears. She expected him to say he was leaving. She expected him to say the deal was off. We'll see the judge, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. A promise. In that moment, he wasn't running. He was staying. He was fighting. For her. For the land. For this strange, fragile thing that had taken root between them. The terrified look in her eyes slowly gave way to disbelief, and then to a flicker of something he had never seen there before, hope. The next day, Redemption Gulch buzzed like a disturbed hive. The arrival of Judge Miller was always an event, but the scheduled hearing of Croft versus, well, Croft, was the real spectacle. The entire town seemed to have gathered in the dusty square in front of the town hall, which served as a makeshift courthouse when the judge was in session. They stood in gossiping clumps, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and sanctimonious judgment. Silas was already there, preening by the courthouse steps. He was flanked by his usual cronies and had dressed for the occasion in a tight-fitting suit that made him look like a stuffed sausage. He was smug, confident, the cat that had the canary cornered. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, waving them occasionally for effect. When Kane and Alara walked into the square, a hush fell over the crowd. They walked side by side, a small, defiant island in a sea of hostility. Kane moved with his usual unnerving calm, his eyes sweeping the crowd, missing nothing, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Alara walked with her head held high, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but she drew strength from the solid, unyielding presence beside her. She had put on her best dress, a simple blue cotton, mended and clean. She looked like what she was, a respectable woman facing down a mob. Judge Miller emerged from the town hall. He was a tall, gaunt man with a severe face and eyes that seemed to see right through lies and bluster. He set up a small table on the porch, Sheriff Barlow hovering uselessly behind him. "Let's get this unpleasant business over with," the judge announced, his voice carrying over the square. "Silas Croft, you've made an accusation of fraud and conspiracy. State your case." Silas stepped forward, his voice oozing false piety. "Your Honor, it is with a heavy heart that I do this. My dear departed brother, Thomas, left his property and his intended, Miss Alara here. In my care he held up the papers. We had an agreement that his land would stay in the family, that she would be provided for by marrying a respectable man. Instead, he pointed a dramatic finger at Cain. She has taken up with this known criminal, this jailbird, in a shameful, fraudulent scheme to steal what is rightfully mine." A murmur went through the crowd. Silas pressed his advantage. "This is not a marriage, Your Honor. It is a mockery. He is an outlaw she hired to scare me off. I ask you to dissolve this farce and enforce my brother's wishes." Judge Miller took the papers from Silas and scanned them, his expression grim. He then looked at Alara. "Miss, what is your name?" "Alara Vance, Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Miss Vance, is this true? Is your arrangement with this man a sham?" All eyes were on her. This was the moment. She could feel Cain's presence beside her, solid as a rock. He didn't speak, didn't prompt her. He was leaving the choice to her. She looked at Silas's leering face, at the hungry eyes of the crowd, and the shame and fear she had felt for weeks finally burned away, replaced by a clean, hard anger. She found her voice. "No, Your Honor, it is not," she said, her tone clear and strong. The crowd stirred. "What is true is that Mr. Croft threatened me. He gave me an ultimatum: marry him or be thrown out with nothing. He has terrorized me since the day his brother died." She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "He doesn't care about his brother's wishes. He cares only about this land, which he is too lazy to work himself. He is a bully and a coward. This document," she pointed at the papers in the judge's hand, "is a lie, just like the man who wrote it." She turned to face the town. "You all stood by and watched. You whispered and judged, but not one of you offered me a hand. This man," she looked at Cain, her voice softening, "this outlaw was the only one who showed me any decency. He protected me. He worked the land. He has treated me with more respect than anyone in this town, including my supposed protector." A shocked silence fell over the square. No one had expected the timid girl to speak with such fire. Judge Miller looked from her impassioned face to Cain's stoic one. "And you, sir?" the judge asked Cain. "What is your intention toward this woman?" Cain didn't look at the judge. His eyes were fixed on Alara. The crowd, the judge, Silas, they all faded away. There was only her, standing there, fierce and brave and beautiful in her defiance. He saw not a bargain, not a convenience, but the woman who had sat with him in a dust storm and listened to his ghosts. The woman whose nightmare had become his watch. "I intend to marry her," he said, his voice resonating with a truth that stunned the crowd, and himself, with its simple power. It was no longer about the land. It was about her. Silas's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. The last vestiges of his control snapped. "Liar!" he roared, his plan crumbling around him. "She's mine." He lunged forward, not at Cain, but at Alara, his hand reaching for her, his face a snarl of rage. Chaos erupted. The crowd gasped and fell back. But Silas never reached her. Cain moved with a speed that was barely human. He was a blur of motion, a striking serpent. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He intercepted Silas's lunge, his arm catching Silas's wrist in a grip of iron. With a sharp twist, a small, wicked-looking knife clattered to the wooden porch. Cain spun Silas around, slamming him face-first against a support post, his arm wrenched behind his back in a hold that made the big man scream in pain. It was over in 2 seconds. Cain stood over the whimpering, defeated Silas, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes burning with a cold fire. The town was silent, shocked into stillness. They had heard the stories about Cain, but now they had seen it. They had seen the feared outlaw's lethal efficiency, but they had also seen that he had used it not to rob or kill, but to protect. Judge Miller, who had not flinched, banged a heavy law book on the table like a gavel. The sound cracked through the silence. "That's enough," he boomed. He pointed at the knife on the ground. "Sheriff Barlow, arrest that man for assault with a deadly weapon." Barlow, jolted into action, hurried forward and, for the first time, put handcuffs on Silas Croft with something resembling authority. The judge tore Silas's document in half and let the pieces flutter to the ground. "This hearing is concluded," he declared, his eyes resting on Cain and Alara. He looked at the subdued Silas being dragged away, at the shaken but resolute woman, and at the dangerous man who stood guard over her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Well," he said, his voice losing some of its severity, "it seems the two of you have a wedding to attend. The courthouse is open." In the aftermath, the crowd dispersed in quiet, chastened groups, their appetite for spectacle satisfied and soured. Silas was hauled to the jail, his bellows of outrage fading down the street. The dust settled, and soon, the square was nearly empty. Cain and Alara were left standing alone on the courthouse porch, the setting sun casting their long shadows behind them. The tension of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving a profound and quiet relief in its place. Cain released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Alara, his gaze searching her face. There was a small, shallow cut high on his cheekbone where Silas's flailing hand had caught him. Without thinking, Alara reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed the back of her hand against the cut. It was a gesture of breathtaking intimacy, a quiet claiming. He didn't flinch or pull away. He stood perfectly still, his stormy eyes fixed on hers, allowing the contact. The wall of ice he had kept around his heart for a decade finally, irrevocably, cracked. "You were brave," he said, his voice hoarse. A small smile touched her lips. "I had a good teacher," she replied softly. They stood there for a moment longer, a world of unspoken emotion passing between them in a single, shared look. The desperate bride and the feared outlaw were gone, replaced by a man and a woman who had faced down the world together and won. He offered her his arm, a formal, almost courtly gesture that felt more natural than anything had before. She took it. They walked, not touching other than that single point of contact, down the steps and towards the open door of the courthouse. The setting sun bathed them in a warm, golden light, merging their two long shadows into one. They were walking toward a future that was no longer a sham or a bargain, but a choice, a life they would build together on a small patch of stubborn land that, against all odds, had become their home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.